This video is brought to you by CuriosityStream. What's up, guys? Helen here to talk about something we collectively hate and yet continue to gluttonously indulge in: election season. You know, that special time when everyone bombards you with digital ads, pleading emails, annoying surveys, and, inexplicably, real paper mail? All to convince you to vote for their choice of fancy-suited, white-toothed candidate. Now, elections are a necessity for any functioning democracy. But nowhere in the Constitution does it mandate that the media spend 2 full calendar years pumping America's homes full of speculation about likability, electability, presidentialness, and, so very occasionally, policy issues. In fact, it kind of makes us freaks on the world stage. Canadians consider 11 weeks to be a long election cycle, while in France, campaigning can't last more than 2 weeks before the first round of voting. Which is to say, the contemporary American presidential election bonanza is not the norm for the world. So, how did we get here? We'll explain in this Wisecrack Edition on American presidential elections. What happened? And if you liked our deep dive into the history of American elections, then you should check out CuriosityStream. CuriosityStream is home to thousands of non-fiction documentary and movie titles about science, nature, food, technology, travel, and, you guessed it, history. Their different series cover all eras of American history, and last night I checked out JFK Fact and Fable. It's a fascinating look at the mythos behind JFK's iconic presidency, and examines why he remains such a powerful figure in American culture. I can't wait to check out everything else they have to offer, and if you want to see for yourself, then you should click the link in the description now. If you use the code Wisecrack, you can get a whole year for just $14.99. That's less than $2 a month for thousands of hours worth of content. You can stream it all right on your phone, laptop, smart TV, and even your Xbox. So check it out today. That's curiositystream.com/wisecrack and use the code Wisecrack at checkout. Thanks to CuriosityStream for sponsoring this episode, and now, back to the show. And now, we gotta talk about a major political heavyweight. You know, President William Henry Harrison. Okay. He's not exactly the sexiest name in politics. If you know him at all, it's because he kicked the bucket almost immediately after becoming president.
There's William Henry Harrison! I died in 30 days!
But his short-lived tenure in the White House was made possible by a pretty radical decision. He campaigned. That's it, that's the radical decision. William Henry Harrison campaigned for the presidency. It sounds totally bananas, but for the first 100 years of American history, it was pretty taboo for a presidential candidate to publicly try to become president. No, really. As Richard J. Ellis and Mark Dedrick explain, for close to 100 years, the prevailing norm was that the presidency was not an office one should actively seek. This precedent dated back to 1789, when George Washington very reluctantly accepted the gig after a unanimous vote by the young country's electors. After years of war and presumably bad food, all this tired general wanted was to chill at home. Instead, he humbly accepted the call of duty. The men who angled to succeed him somewhat followed his example, modestly accepting their party's nomination before disappearing from public view until the results were in. Of course, this stuffy propriety was undoubtedly a performance. If you were Thomas Jefferson, for instance, you wouldn't campaign so much as casually sort of bribe someone to start a newspaper purely for the purposes of roasting your opponents. While publicly campaigning for president wasn't cool, it never stopped tons of candidates like Andrew Jackson or Abraham Lincoln from stealthily controlling their campaigns behind the scenes. But asking people to vote for you directly? That was just kinda tacky. You weren't supposed to be too greedy for power, explains scholar Michael Kazin. Even the presidential embodiment of the Tasmanian Devil, Andrew Jackson, was convinced by his advisors to let up on his letter-writing campaign, and agreeably keep silent when running for re-election. Don't get me wrong, there were still campaigns. Throughout the century, surrogates and supporters of candidates would do the dirty work of actually rousing voters. But as scholar Jeffrey Tullis puts it, candidates exemplified a public teaching that political campaigns were beneath the dignity of men suited for governance. As land ownership requirements were abolished, newly eligible voters, that is, landless white dudes, wanted to know who the hell they were voting for. This created a tension where candidates wanted to be appropriately dignified, while also telling average Joes what they thought. Enter my man Harrison, who ignited what scholar Kathleen Hall Jamieson calls the presidency's first full-blown campaign in 1840. Harrison was a military man, but his record was a bit spotty. When he first ran for president as a Whig in 1836, he orchestrated a tour through 4 states where he was met with horse-drawn carriage parades, bonfires, and singing. He gave ostensibly apolitical speeches about the importance of the Declaration of Independence and inoffensive patriotic stuff. Still, dude lost, but things were gonna get real wild in 1840. That's when Harrison once again tried for the presidency, this time at least pretending to be intent on maintaining the basic decorum Washington had shown by staying the hell home. After all, he had explained where he stood on everything in 1836, right? Tell that to the Democratic newspapers, who instantly responded by calling him General Mum, a caged simpleton, and an old granny for refusing to voice his stance on the issues. Other attacks decried him as a sort of backwoods yahoo who would be content to live in a log cabin drinking cider and collecting his pension. What they didn't know is that Harrison's Whig Party would seize on this imagery, making the log cabin, hard cider, and objectively dope coonskin hat the symbol of his campaign. Ironically, Harrison was actually born to a wealthy family, and lived in a mansion. Anyway, intent on defending himself and his physical strength, Harrison embarked on a tour around the country, holding raucous, cider-drenched rallies to prove how tough he was. Still, he at least pretended to have some reservations. In one speech, Harrison confessed that this campaigning violated his sense of propriety, and that he feared he was establishing a dangerous precedent. He told crowds that he wasn't there to campaign, but this didn't stop him from decrying his opponents. Basically, the first real campaign was kind of just the result of one man's refusal to, look like he was sitting at home twiddling his thumbs. In the process, Harrison, who was maligned for being the then oldest candidate at 68 years of age, rebranded himself as a 19th century all-American bro. This is what Jameson calls the first example of image advertising in presidential campaigning. And after some exhausting mid-19th century travel, Harrison won. Intent on looking strong at the inauguration ceremony, he did not wear a hat or a coat despite the miserable weather, because wearing a coat is for sissies, I guess. Anyway, he talked for 2 hours and got seriously sick, though most probably from drinking contaminated Washington, D.C. water. Anyway, he died just 4 weeks after, which, bummer. But Harrison's log cabin revolution didn't change everything so fast. For the next 3 elections, publicly taking to the stump, that is, traveling the nation giving the same speech over and over again, was actually considered a bad move. The only candidate to repeat Harrison's ballsy antics was Whig General Winfield Scott, who earned Democratic disdain for encouraging man worship. When he lost, everyone extolled his victorious opponent Franklin Pierce and his silence, and blamed Scott for being a blabbermouth. This continued from 1860 to 1872, during which Democrats kept stumping and kept losing. However, image advertising was still evolving. You couldn't go anywhere without seeing a photograph of Abe Lincoln's face, but the guy was nowhere to be found. He didn't write letters or make speeches, or participate in debates. Those famous Lincoln-Douglas debates were actually over a Senate seat, which was a little more kosher. Anyway, the curse of the stump loomed large, but at the same time, people wanted to hear their guy talk. So, in the late 19th century, we saw a kind of uneasy transition into the front porch speech, where several candidates like James Garfield or Benjamin Harrison invited supporters over to watch them speak from their house. Which wasn't technically campaigning because you were just being a polite host, okay? Like how it isn't technically assault if I just swing this bat wildly around and you just happen to be in front of me. Which is to say, it totally is. And so, slowly, it becomes increasingly less taboo for the presidential candidate to speak for themselves. But this modest style of campaigning would get seriously undermined with one William Jennings Bryan, former Democratic congressman and renowned orator. Bryan never won the presidency, but he'd go down in history for revolutionizing the modern campaign. A pioneer of the whistle-stop tour, which used the fledgling railway system to traverse a nation, Bryan embarked on 4 big trips, giving stump speeches at nearly every railway stop. His regimen of 600 passionate speeches in 3 months reached, by some estimates, 5 million Americans. Meanwhile, his opponent, William McKinley, stuck to the chiller front porch campaign, while letting a sprawling network of surrogates do most of the campaigning for him. At the same time, Bryan encountered pushback from Republicans who criticized him for begging for the presidency as a tramp might beg for a pie. But Bryan knew he was playing to his strengths as an incredibly effective orator known for rousing crowds to mania with lines like, "You shall not crucify mankind on a cross of gold." Though Bryan lost, he marked an important moment in campaign history, when, according to Ellis and Dedrick, the nominee was expected to be the primary spokesman and central figure of the campaign. This is the world we exist in today, of course. But with this change came another development: the rise of the personality. Or more specifically, the packaged personality for candidates. And as speeches would start moving from stump tours to your home, via radio and television, people began to care more and more about what their favorite candidate was like. Are they a huge dweeb? Can I have a beer with them? Do I get the vague sense that they moonlight as a serial killer? Franklin Roosevelt, like his Uncle Teddy, seemed to recognize this instinctively, and his ability to project warmth, likability, and supreme competence in newsreels and over the radio encouraged a nation. While an incumbent president campaigning for re-election was still generally frowned upon, FDR, for the most part, spun himself more diplomatically as a president of the whole people, and got away with it. Of course, Roosevelt was consciously doing some major image advertising a la our boy Harrison. The guy was savvy about the way he packaged his own brand, always campaigning with his same cigarette holder, jaunty top hat, pince-nez, and smile. He effortlessly exuded a compelling personality, equal parts jokester and calming voice of reason. Stricken with polio, Roosevelt was determined to portray physical strength in the media and developed all kinds of sneaky ways to hide his paralysis. In his political career, he'd pull stunts to emphasize his strength, like flying to the National Convention to accept his candidacy back when air travel was dangerous, and embarking on railroad tours where he was able to appear to be standing on his own while secretly being supported by a steel bar. Overall, Roosevelt used campaigning to prove he was presidential, both in its assumed norms of health and this whole personality-driven "I'm a man" shtick. Of course, we can see similar themes rippling into today, when our current president works overtime to stress his vigor and health after contracting a deadly virus.
I feel much better now.
So, in some ways, the quest to prove yourself tough, healthy, and manly has been something of a constant. But a lot else has changed. Specifically, the rhetoric of how personality is conveyed. But if you want to understand how our personality-driven elections have become a non-stop blitz of TV ads and dumb optics, we need to talk about Dwight D. Eisenhower, the first TV candidate. Now, it's not that Eisenhower was just the first candidate to widely campaign on TV. It's that he handed over a big chunk of his strategy to ad men. It was 1951, and though he was the most popular man in America, Eisenhower had no government experience outside the military, and so sought to convey legitimacy. Instead of counting on the lengthy speeches of yore, he hired ad men to produce several dozen short TV spots of him answering advertiser-penned questions recited by average Americans with advertiser-penned answers. To say these were light on policy, or any substance for that matter, is an understatement. Eisenhower initially worried that these ads were undignified, but was convinced to give it a shot. At the ad men's behest, he removed his glasses, changed his clothes, and talked faster. In this way, according to scholar John E. Hollitz, Eisenhower's ad men had accomplished the first successful attempt to sell a presidential candidate by employing the same techniques that sold soap and toothpaste. Now, if you preferred a less made-for-TV candidate, you might have fancied the hyper-intellectual Adlai Stevenson. He was called an egghead for being a smarty-pants who talked fancy. His beautiful rhetoric was, of course, irrelevant, because he looked hella uncomfortable on screen, struggling with a teleprompter and flashing an awkward smile. Stevenson loathed appearing in political ads, considering them too short to fully express his ideas, and let's just say his performances didn't have that special pizzazz.
Which the Eisenhower administration has been giving away.
He's been described as a 19th century style presidential candidate, who, unlike his opponent, refused to be packaged or phony. While Republicans spent somewhere around $1 million on TV ads, Democrats spent just $77,000. Stevenson ran against Eisenhower, and lost, twice, demonstrating that packaging your personality was now paramount. The intimacy of television demanded that the candidate be personable, showing empathy and likability. Above all, it solidified the importance of TV-friendly catchlines over any meaningful engagement with the issues. And we're still feeling the effects today. So, to win the presidency, now you had to be palatable on television. You see what's coming. After all, what's more palatable than a goddamn celebrity? Enter JFK, an incredibly charismatic politician who spent 5 years building a grassroots operation and giving speeches to gain popularity. If Eisenhower was the first TV candidate, Kennedy was the first candidate actually made for TV, able to give short, decisive answers with profound eloquence. And he knew it. Packaging his persona as that of the youthful, vital, compassionate, strong leader, Kennedy had this thing in the bag. As his father put it, "We're going to sell Jack like soap flakes." It was Kennedy who would invite his opponent, Richard Nixon, to the first ever presidential debate. Taking place on millions of TV screens, it wasn't even a fair fight. The youthful and aesthetically blessed Kennedy spent weeks tanning and wore a bit of stage makeup, which Nixon refused, appearing pale, nervous, and sweaty in a suit that blended into the background. There's lore that radio listeners believed Nixon won and TV viewers believed Kennedy had, but not really enough data to back it up. Still, what we do know is that the debate was so decisive in boosting Kennedy's campaign, eventually to victory, that no sitting president agreed to participate in debates for another 16 years. The presidency had now, in many ways, firmly become a bona fide popularity contest. Once a candidate becomes a packaged personality, it becomes very easy to become obsessed with anything that might tarnish that packaging. Candidates began to see if they were likable enough with hyper-specific polling data. The rise of this data, and the weakening of party power, did something specific to our politics, as outlined by Sidney Blumenthal in his 1980 book The Permanent Campaign. Starting with Lyndon Johnson, Blumenthal explained, we saw the act of governance become a perpetual effort to get re-elected, with the combined use of political strategy and image-making. As Blumenthal writes, permanent campaigning remakes government into an instrument designed to sustain an elected official's popularity. Essentially, this meant the line between campaigning and governing started to disappear, as presidents made choices and conveyed messages increasingly based on the reaction it would incur from the American people. According to scholar Hugo Heclo, the strategy of permanent campaigning crystallized under Richard Nixon, who employed unprecedented White House use of public opinion polling, political consultants, and comprehensive media strategies, and the like, in pursuit of a second term. To those who hated him, Heclo writes, the man's whole political existence seemed a shabby and conniving permanent campaign. This arguably can be seen in his inconsistency on civil rights. When courting Northern black votes in 1960, he seemed generally committed to the cause.
Equal rights for all our citizens. Why must we vigorously defend them? First, because it is right and just.
When courting Southern white votes in 1972, he was against laws that would further integrate schools.
I do not believe that busing to achieve racial balance is in the interest of better education.
And, by admission of his own campaign, invoked racist anxieties with dog whistle rhetoric.
By 1968, you can't say that hurts or backfires, so you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff.
The permanent campaign and paramount importance of political celebrity continued with literal Hollywood/political celebrity Ronald Reagan's rise to power. After easily beating incumbent Jimmy Carter, Reagan did something unexpected. He brought all of his campaign's best pollsters, media masters, and tacticians with him to the White House. There, they worked throughout his presidency, using the same campaign techniques to address and win the approval of the American people. As a 1981 New York Times article put it, for the Reagan White House, every night is election night on television. Their obsessive strategizing was why, according to the Times, Reagan had such stunning success in shaping public opinion. Of course, with constant campaigning comes constant image making. Reagan used his first term to cultivate his own mythology. That meant endless strategic photo ops showing him riding horses, chopping wood, pumping iron. Like many a candidate before him, the oldest president no doubt felt pressure to portray himself as a dude who does dude-like things. While Reagan had previously run on a reasonably robust platform of reducing inflation and taxes, his 1984 campaign was, according to a Republican strategist, virtually issueless. His ads peddled largely an image-based patriotism, with nary a policy discussion to be found. This is when that song "I'm Proud to Be an American" became something of an anthem for 50% of the country and a terrible earworm for future generations. The phenomenon of the permanent campaign can be traced in each subsequent presidency. At the same time, Heclo notes, the politics of permanent campaigning and the media's consequent framing of every day as a political battle that is to be won or lost prioritizes dramatic conflict over meaningful debate about the issues. Over the next 30 years, the permanent campaign became an ongoing quest to seem presidential, aka likable and popular, as candidates and presidents alike turned increasingly to entertainment venues like talk shows to establish their homespun likability. Once elected, they continued to re-establish that likability, over and over and over again.
How does it feel having a 3-inch vertical? it's a 3-inch horizontal.
George Bush took 416 trips, frequently to swing states, in his first 3 years, while Bill Clinton even created a voter poll to decide where he should go on vacation. So the line between governing and campaigning continued to erode. All the while, more and more money would continue to pour into the political game of marketing charisma, particularly after the Citizens United decision, which allowed for limitless money to flood into elections. At the same time, as the media increasingly focused on the most contentious aspects of politicking rather than actual policy issues, negative ads about the other candidates' personal suckiness dominated. By 2012, only 14.3% of ads were positive, according to a University of Mississippi study. Which brings us to today, when presidents must seem presidential, but no one can seem to agree what that means. While eschewing many norms of running a campaign, Donald Trump is paradoxically the natural extension of years of increased obsession with presidential personality. The former Apprentice star has spent years preoccupied with his own celebrity, crafting an image as a shrewd businessman unencumbered by any rules. At the same time, Democratic attacks of him center around how unpresidential his personality is. And of course, Trump is the embodiment of the permanent candidate, filing his paperwork for re-election the day he took office, and continuing rallies throughout his tenure and a pandemic. By this point, we'd all become so used to the permanent campaign that it took his extreme approach to make anybody really notice something strange was going on. After one more campaign season that seems to stretch on for eternity, and a series of debates that could only be described generously as hell on earth,
Will you shut up, man?
we're left wondering if keeping up to date on campaign news is making us less rather than more informed. Maybe our fixation on the personality and personal proclivities of any individual candidate hasn't just become inane, but dangerous. When we're obsessed with someone's likability, we can find ourselves lulled into supporting the most grotesque policies. Political campaigning began in the first place because people wanted to know where their candidates stood on the issues. It's devolved to the point where candidate positions often feel more inscrutable after watching them debate, or in an ad or on a talk show. As much reporting as there is about the candidates and their presidentialness, it can feel like there's very little actually being taught or learned. But who knows? Maybe we're all becoming savvy to this. Maybe there will be some magical backlash when people start speculating about the 2024 election 3 weeks from now. Or maybe we can stop the weird personality worship of politicians. One can only dream. But what do you guys think? Is the American campaign cycle just proof of how good we are at democracy? Or is it a literal scourge in our nation and also raising my blood pressure for no reason? Let us know what you think in the comments. Big thanks to our patrons for all your support. Slam that subscribe button like it's your worst political enemy. And as always, thanks for watching.